Hello, my name is Melissa, and for my essay and thus for this oral presentation of my plan, I have chosen topic 3, which has prompted me to pick one example from the literature that tests the theoretical basis of how culture of stress can have a negative impact on a person's physical or mental well-being. In relation to the objectives of this presentation, I decided to break down this prompt into its constituents, highlighted here in colour, and hence the main objectives of my presentation largely revolve around addressing each of these highlighted colours, and they are as follows. Defining a culture of stress, discussing the different contexts of cultural contact and how these different categories of acculturating groups play a role in the development of acculturative stress, with focus on immigrants and refugees as the predominant example from literature. How acculturation and associated stress can directly influence mental health, immigrant and refugee mental health, and how it can be impacted by stresses occurring before migration, during migration, and post-migration, and how impaired mental health caused by acculturative stress may be propagated by other cultural factors. My first source is titled Comparative Studies of Acculturative Stress, and it was published in 1987 in the International Migration Review Journal. Berry described acculturative stress as impaired psychosocial and somatic health in individuals who must adapt to a new culture, and this paper identified 5 categories of changes that result from acculturation of a group or individual into a host society, and I've listed them here in this middle bubble. It was prefaced that psychological changes typically succeed and may be of a direct result of the first 4 categories of change that have been listed, with all of these categories representing potential stresses for acculturative stress. Berry noted that mental health problems may arise during acculturation but are not always inevitable. Rather, he emphasized, and this was the main imperative of the review, he emphasized how the nature of the acculturating group and their mode of acculturation, explored in Table 1 here, factors in on the level of acculturative stress experience. Note that data found for immigrants and refugees is most relevant to my discussion as they are my chosen example, so that's what I'll be focusing on when discussing his findings. Studies addressing all 5 types of acculturating groups listed in the previous slide were compared in this paper, and Berry found that involuntary groups, including refugees who were forcibly displaced, experienced higher levels of acculturative stress in comparison to voluntary groups such as immigrants. And this can be observed in this column graph that I've extracted from the same paper. Further findings include English-speaking ability as a potential protective factor against acculturative stress, as Korean immigrants studied by Kim in 1984 showed higher stress with less usage of English. Source 2, titled The Prevalence of Depression Symptoms and Associated Sociodemographic and Clinical Correlates Among Syrian Refugees in Lebanon, is a research article that was published very recently in 2021. Firstly, it provides some background information and concepts, including how stresses experienced by refugees exacerbate a refugee's vulnerability to not only mental health conditions, but somatic or physical conditions also. Moreover, mental health conditions associated with seeking refuge and acculturation is further impacted by failure to receive the proper treatment or support, and this is largely due to cultural stigmas surrounding mental health as being a real and relevant health issue, as well as lack of accessibility to adequate mental health services. The study design involved a cross-sectional survey design across 4 Syrian refugee-tented settlements in Lebanon, and depressive symptoms were screened using the patient health questionnaires PHQ-2 and PHQ-9. Results found positive PHQ-9 screening, which is reflective of moderate to severe depression symptoms, was detected in around 25% of the sample population. So now and his colleagues extrapolated this data and estimated and concluded that 1 in 4 Syrian refugees living in Lebanon express moderate to severe depression symptoms. These findings are significant as much lower depression rates of only 9.9% were previously reported among the general population living in Lebanon. Source 3, our final source, is a review article titled Mental Health of Immigrants and Refugees that was published in 2005 in the Community Mental Health Journal. It evaluates the findings of various studies and reviews stresses as being mental health risk factors of immigrant and refugee populations. The primary concept of this review was that stresses not only contribute to acculturative stress, but that they themselves act as risk factors for mental health, and that these stresses can be categorized into pre-migration, migration-related, and post-migration categories. Pre-migration stresses typically involve traumatic exposure in an individual's homeland, including war, terrorism, natural disasters, or famine. Migration-related stresses can include separations from family members and detention in refugee camps. And finally, post-migration stresses are typified by the qualities of the host society and how well an individual is likely to adjust and acculturate. For example, lower levels of education acquisition and employment associated with immigrants is a post-migration stressor. The exposure and proximity to these stressors were correlated with depression and anxiety disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder, and they were also established to be linked to behavioral consequences such as domestic violence and pathological gambling. I will now be exploring the strengths and weaknesses of the sources I've just discussed. So, Berry's work on adaptation and acculturation has been the dominant theory in understanding psychology and culture, so he's a highly credible researcher. Source 1, a comparative review, specifically provides fundamental findings in the field of study relating to acculturation and mental health. Hence, despite its publishing date of 1987, it persists as a very strong source with modern-day relevance, as it is still being continuously referenced in current papers today. However, it is still important to acknowledge the age of the source as a potential limitation, as the data from all of the studies reviewed in this paper date back to the 1980s or even earlier. Another weakness would be that sampling for each reviewed study was only done from those living in Canada, and hence it may not be accurate nor valid to generalise this data from these specific studies to other host societies such as Australia, America, or countries in Europe. A big strength of Source 2, which is a research article, is that it has been peer-reviewed, which is likely to confer higher validity and quality. The method of data collection that Niall and his colleagues use, the PHQ-9 survey, has been previously proven to be of high validity and reliability also, and this can be considered a strength. However, in the context of this particular group, which is Syrian refugees living in tented settlements in Lebanon, it may have reduced validity due to factors including bias. For example, social desirability biases may have altered the way participants answered questions regarding alcohol use, suppressive symptoms, or employment, especially since these questions were answered in interviews rather than by self-reported means. Moreover, due to high levels of literacy and lower levels of comprehension observed in these tented settlements, this method of data collection, although objectively of high reliability, may not be the best. Finally, Source 3, a review paper, showed strength in the diversity of populations used as samples across the reviewed studies. Compared to our first two sources, there was a greater range of geographical diversity as well as age diversity, potentially allowing for a more valid generalization of the findings. That being said, the paper focused on summarizing points made in other articles rather than specific quantitative data, which I do consider to be a great weakness. Moreover, it has not been peer-reviewed, which may also serve as an issue of validity. The impact of acculturative stress on one's mental health, specific to my example of refugees and immigrants, as a field of study has not been heavily experimented on. The majority of the literature in Canada was in the form of review articles rather than research articles that focus on the topic of acculturative stress independently, or even on immigrant and refugee mental health independent of acculturative stress. So considering this, I am confident in using the evidence of these three listed sources to guide my conclusions about the negative implications of acculturative stress on mental health, and thus I've perceived certain weaknesses outlined in the previous slide as being more negligible than significant. The overarching theme across all three sources, and even in the external literature that I reviewed, is the individuality or personal nature of acculturative stress and its subsequent impacts on mental health. By this, I mean that there are many factors that determine the level of so-called negative impact on mental health outlined in the topic prompt, including the context of cultural contact and the different kinds of stresses that an individual may experience. By context of cultural contact, I mean whether it is done through tourism, migration, or refuge seeking, the latter two of which my three sources focused on. And based on evidence provided by Source 1, prolonged culture contact through immigration or refuge seeking is likely to negatively impact mental health, and this is further quantitatively supported by Source 2, which showed an increased prevalence of depressive symptoms in Syrian refugees in Lebanon compared to those experienced by the general Lebanon population. Moreover, I have deduced that voluntary migration, in the case of immigrants, is likely associated with lower levels of acculturative stress and mental health risks compared to the forceful involuntary displacement experienced by refugees. Another factor is the kinds of stresses an individual may experience. And this was prefaced by Source 2, which established stresses as being predictive of mental health risk factors. However, further detail was provided by Source 3. Source 3 went on to categorize these stresses as being either pre-migration stresses, migration-related stresses, or post-migration stresses. And this categorization of stresses into three time-associated classes is quite a significant point, as most of the literature that I reviewed, including Source 1 and 2, focused on stresses experienced by an individual following migration, and thus they neglected any real-time or previous stresses that may have contributed to later acculturative stress. To conclude, I believe that these sources are critical in establishing the fundamental skeleton of my essay arguments. However, I intend on exploring country or culture-specific examples to further bolster the arguments that I've outlined here.